and the Championship, Chapter 21, entitled The Bus Ride. At the start of the field trip, the fifth graders still didn't know where they were headed. They waited impatiently outside the school, fidgeting with their cameras and angling their science journals to catch the sunlight. Normally, lab notebooks don't reflect light, but normally lab notebooks aren't covered in foil chip bags, as most of these were, thanks to an art class taught by Lily Matisse's mom. "Did you bring Fathead?" PW asked Leon. "Of course. You know what Sparks says. The scientist always prepares for inspiration to strike." "The only thing I'm worrying might strike is Lumpkin," said Lily Matisse. "We've got to get our hands on that jacket," said PW. Where are we money-wise?" Lily Matisse, who was acting as the treasurer for the jacket fund, said, "We're up to $31.50, plus $4 that my mom still owes me for filling glue pots." "That brings us to $35.50, said PW. $159.99 minus $35.50 equals, let's see, that's the same as $160 minus $35.50 equals $124.50. Take away a penny equals $124.49. If we keep doing extra chores, we'll have the jacket by the arrival of the school bus, and the crush it caused prevented PW from completing his guesstimation. Mr. Sparks stood inside the bus and called through the glass. "What's the secret password?" "Globuli Solaniani," the fifth graders shouted. Mr. Sparks stepped back and pulled on a long metal handle. His students piled in. "Time to tell you what we're up to," said Mr. Sparks excitedly as his students hustled for seats close to the front. "Despite what you may have heard, Globuli Solaniani is not a fatal disease that makes your limbs fall off at night. Nor is it a giant sea slug that lives on the ocean floor. Anyone figure out what it is?" The class had no idea, or rather, the class had tons of ideas, none of which were correct. It was actually Henry Lumpkin who came closest to unlocking the mystery. All eyes focused on Lumpkin, who was as startled as the others to hear his name mentioned. "Yes," said Mr. Sparks, "Henry Lumpkin, Sr. pretty much nailed it at Parents' Night when he said that Globuli Solaniani sounded like a mouthful." The students giggled expectantly. "Well, I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Globuli Solaniani is the Latin phrase for a certain substance with which you all have some familiarity." Would anyone care to attempt a translation? "Potato chips!" the whole class hollered. "You are a smart bunch," said Mr. Sparks. "But more to the point, the phrase has been promoted by a certain scientist named Fertles." Leon immediately guessed what was up. "We're not going to the Fertles potato chip factory, are we, Mr. Sparks?" For an agonizing moment, the whole bus waited for an answer to that question. "Yes," said Mr. Sparks at last, "we are." Over the joyful shouts of his students, Mr. Sparks said, "I would contend that the coolest phrase in any language must be potato chips. However, field trip ranks a close second, and when you combine the two phrases, well, I ask you, what could be cooler than that?" "Nothing, to judge from the cheering." Mr. Sparks turned to Mr. Groot, the wood shop instructor, who also took class pictures and drove the school bus. "Okay, Herman," he said, "let's roll." Mr. Groot released the parking brake and shifted into gear. But just as he was about to pull away, a distinct tapping sound intruded on the mobile merrymaking. Thomas Warchowski was the first to locate the source of the tapping. "It's the hag!" he exclaimed. All at once, the cheering stopped. Alarm spread through the bus like poison gas. Mr. Sparks gazed at the fourth-grade teacher through the window, who made a show of pointing at his watch. "We're running late," he mouthed, tossing up his hands apologetically. The tapping persisted. "Herman," said Mr. Sparks, "cut the engine." He reached for the door handle and allowed Miss Hagmaier to board. She was wearing her usual get-up: black cape, black lace-up boots, pantyhose the color of cooked liver, a helmet of black hair that everyone on the bus, with the possible exception of Mr. Groot, knew to be fake. She had a clasp on her cape made from glass eyeballs, a reminder of her love of stuffed animals. And in her bony fingers she gripped her tapper, a dagger-sized sewing needle designed as an instructional tool, but adapted by Miss Hagmaier for disciplinary ends. "Phyllis," said Mr. Sparks, "to what do we owe the pleasure?" "Pleasure has nothing to do with my presence," Miss Hagmaier replied brusquely. "I'm here to chaperone." "Surely Mr. Groot can provide the necessary backup, don't you think?" "It really doesn't matter a stitch what I think," Miss Hagmaier grumbled. "It's what Principal Birdwhistle thinks that counts, and she thinks you need me. So here I am." Miss Hagmaier waved the sewing needle at her former students. "I tried to teach these ruffians last year. I know what they're capable of." "I see," said Mr. Sparks. "I could use your help, of course, Phyllis, but I wouldn't dream of taking you away from your current fourth graders." "Don't worry about them. They're working on their costumes for the medieval carnival. They'll be supervised until we get back." "Oh," said Mr. Sparks, his voice all but disappearing. Miss Hagmaier wasted little time taking charge. "Okay, you troublemakers, you know the drill. Hop to it. I want to see everyone seated alphabetically by last name." She marched up the aisle, casting her eyes and her needle right and left. "Tighten that seatbelt, Miss Breed. Zip it, Miss Jaspro. Feet out of the aisle, Mr. Lumpkin. Is that bubble gum I see, Mr. Warchowski? Swallow it now." When she reached the rear of the bus, her tone softened. "How's the new Animile progressing, Leon?" she purred. "Fine. Nearly finished?" Leon shook his head and clutched his backpack. Special attention from Miss Hagmaier was the last thing he wanted. "Well, let me know when your Animile is done." "Okay," Leon whispered. As soon as Miss Hagmaier claimed her seat, Thomas Warchowski turned to Leon. "You really making an Animile just for yourself?" Leon noticed Lumpkin eavesdropping and quickly changed the subject. "Think the hag's here to spy on Sparks?" "Probably," Thomas Warchowski answered. "It's all over the school how ugly things got at Parents' Night." "Pipe down!" Leon cringed. He kept forgetting about Miss Hagmaier's super-powerful hearing and equally powerful voice. "While I must bow to Mr. Sparks in matters of science, I will pull rank when it comes to conduct. So pay attention, you chatterboxes. I will only say this once. Turn the volume to low. No ifs, ands, or buts."